Well, hello and welcome. This is a planetary or space policy or space advocacy update coming to you live from Planetary Society headquarters in Pasadena, California. I'm Mat Kaplan, the host of Planetary Radio, the Society's weekly radio show and podcast. Hope many of you are listeners. And to my left and your right, your left as well, is the boss, the CEO of the Planetary Society, Bill Nye, the science guy.
Welcome. Matt, I got to say, as a longtime television professional, I think it's really to their right.
I'm looking at it here. Maybe so.
It is to your right.
It is to the right. On YouTube, it's to the right. On my other screen, it's to the left.
That's what the electronics. But we're talking about space policy and advocacy, and I just heard a voice whom you're going to introduce.
Hi, yes. Casey. Casey Dreier is the director of space policy for the Planetary Society. How are you, Casey?
I'm doing great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for calling in. This is fun. This is one of my favorite things to do every couple of months when we have the opportunity to do this.
We really look forward to bringing you these updates on what you have enabled us to do in Washington, D.C., the fight to make sure that space exploration gets the level of support and attention there within the Beltway that we believe and we think you believe it deserves. And I want to mention one more time, for those of you who have joined us by phone, we have people on YouTube and we have people on the phone. Welcome to you all. If you're on the phone, please do keep your phone muted until we say we're ready to take your questions, and that time will come, I promise you. Now, for those of you on YouTube, we are monitoring the live chat, which should be on the page in the window that you have open that you're watching right now. And we will keep an eye on that, and you are welcome to submit those questions anytime you like. But first, we're going to get underway with a little bit of a sort of a recap of the current status of things from Bill and Casey. And Casey, I think you could probably start us with that. It's been a quiet month in Washington, hasn't it, Casey?
Not really much going on, you know. Of course, yeah, lots going on, but actually not a whole lot with space. So, I mean, the real essence of where we are right now is holding pattern, right? Obviously we have a new administration coming in. The new administration is, like most new administrations, busy staffing their very top level parts of government. Though, as many of you know, that has been happening far more slowly than in recent history. There's approximately 700 or so nominations the White House has to make that need to be then approved by the Senate. And NASA has 3 of those positions. That's the NASA administrator, the deputy administrator, and the chief financial officer. We don't have nominations for any of those yet, and much less going through a Senate confirmation process.
Casey, for reference, who are the outgoing people in those 3 positions?
Charlie Bolden was the NASA administrator. He left on January 20th with now ex-President Obama. David Newman was the deputy administrator, and then David Radzanowski was the CFO of NASA. And all of those folks left. Not unusual for that to happen. And it's one of those situations where NASA's civil servants basically step up. Robert Lightfoot is the acting NASA administrator right now. And they very much kind of take on a steady as she goes approach in the midst of a transition. They won't make major decisions until they get direction or approval from the White House. They won't change anything either. They won't necessarily back off of any major programs or focuses of NASA. So NASA's still on a journey to Mars. NASA's still working on its big projects and kind of continuing business as usual until they hear otherwise. So that's where we are with NASA. And we also have, obviously, Congress is back in session. The 115th Congress began in January as well. The Senate has actually advanced a piece of space legislation that passed unanimously in the Senate called the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. Matt and I discussed this with my colleague Jason Callahan on our Planetary Radio Space Policy Edition podcast a couple of times. It's a pretty decent bill. It would be the first NASA authorization bill in about 7 years. And it's, as you might expect, kind of a steady as she goes bill. It is a transition act. It's a shot across the bow by Congress to the White House saying, do not cancel our favorite programs, particularly the Space Launch System and Orion. It also then continues and gives some good supportive language to Mars 2020 rover, Europa mission, James Webb Space Telescope. It asks for several reports about how NASA intends to get humans to Mars. It wants to study how they could use the Orion spacecraft in low Earth orbit. My guess is that study will not give pretty happy answers to a lot of people, but they're going to study it. So it passed the Senate by unanimous consent. It now moves to the House. The House is expecting to pass it relatively soon, perhaps as early as this week, more likely later this in March. So we have legislation moving through that's pretty decent legislation. We have a White House that has yet to really take much of a stance on NASA and really make some decisions, though there are, obviously rumors floating left and right. So we're following all this very closely.
But the key word to me there, Casey, was unanimous, right?
Yes. A good way to get unanimous consent in the Senate these days is to not do anything particularly controversial. And this bill does not do anything controversial. But it is. Bill, you bring up a good point, which there is still possibilities for bipartisan work, particularly in space. This bill was sponsored by Ted Cruz, not known as the most get along to go along kind of a guy there is out there, but it was co-sponsored by Bill Nelson from Florida, a Democrat from Florida. So you have a common interest here. It also had a lot of bipartisan co-sponsors. I think Patty Murray in Washington. We had Cory Gardner in Colorado, general kind of big space states. And that's always a really good sign. And again, that the fact that it went through by unanimous consent, they can move that a lot faster. They'll probably do something like that in the House. And, once that passes, or should it pass, it'll only apply for about a year. But again, it would be the first policy authorization, the first policy legislation passed by the Congress, likely to be signed by the president in 7 years. The last NASA authorization was a little different, right? That's the one that created the Space Launch System that was in reaction to the cancellation of the Constellation program. And that was a big push to get through Congress back in 2010. It was the White House pushed back a lot because they wanted to double down on commercial crew. Congress did not let them. But again, it was a very important piece of legislation. That expired in 2013. And so NASA has been operating without an authorization by Congress for the last few years, though they've basically, in practicality, just extended the existing legislation. So this one doesn't change nearly as much. It's a much simpler thing, but it basically says, I think it's a really insightful statement by Congress that these are the programs we like, don't mess with these programs. And I think the White House is going to get that message, and you're seeing that in a bunch of hints kind of around DC right now. Also, who's in the running for NASA administrator and what types of things they're saying about these major programs.
Before we go on, I've heard a few more people come on the telephone line. Welcome to you as well. I want to mention once again, please mute your telephone microphone, mute your phone at your end, and we will let you know when we are ready to take those live questions over the phone. If you can't mute it, just stay as quiet as you can. And we are once again inviting your questions now. If you hear something from Casey or Bill that you want to comment on or ask us a question about, go ahead and type those in if you're watching the YouTube channel in the chat window, and we will keep an eye on those, and we will get to as many as we can. Casey, you shared with us this document, 2017 Legislative Priorities for the Planetary Society. So if we can kind of shift into what the society is looking to make happen, there are some ambitious hopes here.
Probably not too ambitious. I'd say reasonable hopes. No, so we're putting together, we have 3 top legislative priorities, and really these are for the spring of 2017. And particularly why...
Right? The spring of 2017 is pretty much
now. Yeah, is right now. These may shift towards the end of the year as we go through more legislation. But what we're really talking about here is that fundamentally, the Congress did not finish the job last year in funding the U.S. government. So what we're under right now is what's called a CR, a continuing resolution that has extended 2016 funding levels into the fiscal year 2017.
Hey, Casey, is a continuing resolution how NASA has operated without an authorization since 2013, or is that a separate type of legislation?
These are different pieces of legislation. So authorization is a policy prescription, an official statement by Congress saying this is what NASA should do, and it has nothing to do, they give funding recommendations, but that legislation does not itself fund NASA. You have a different committee that funds NASA. This is Congress. Congress loves committees. two primary committees we're concerned about. Science Committee, that writes authorizations, that tells NASA what to do. And then you have the Budget Committee or the Appropriations Committee that gives NASA the money to do what it wants to do. Now, in practice, there's a little bit of cross-pollination between the two. You'll see policy prescriptions in the appropriations bills, and you'll see some funding caps maybe in the authorization bills. But fundamentally, two different committees, two different sets of congresspeople. One funds NASA, one tells NASA what to do. And you can see sometimes there will always there could be problems that NASA could be told to do something and the money may never show up because it's a different set of people. So fundamentally, the Appropriations Committee is the committee in Congress that is supposed to write the funding bill, the annual funding bill every year for Congress, for the entire federal government. They did not finish the job last year, and what they passed is a continuing resolution that keeps the doors open, keeps the lights on, keeps people's salaries coming in government. And that just extends the last funding cycle they did in 2016. The authorization bill that it continues in absentia basically after the expiration of the last one, that's more of a informal practice to keep Congress happy, but NASA is under no commitment to keep it going if they don't want to, but it's a smart move since Congress ultimately funds and tells them what to do. So authorizations never have to happen. In practice, they rarely do. The only part of government that gets an authorization bill every year is the Department of Defense. And you can figure out probably why that is, because that's a $600 billion, industry around the entire country. Everyone gets a piece of it. Everyone is very invested in getting an authorization for defense. NASA's far smaller, so it's not as big of a deal. You don't see as much political push for that. However, you always have to fund it, otherwise the government shuts down. So this continuing resolution that we're in expires in April 12th, I believe. And if they don't pass another bill to fund the government for the rest of the year, the government will shut down on April 13th. So this is going to be a big deal. We had some good kind of green shoots, signs about NASA funding in the 2017 appropriations bills that we did see last year.
Green shoots funding. This is.
Am I mixing my metaphors here?
No, I was just checking in.
We had some good signs. So what happened was the House and the Senate both released draft bills to fund NASA for 2017. And in the House bill in particular, we had they gave an extra $500 million to NASA's budget above the president's request. They gave an extra $300 or so million to planetary science above the president's request. And they gave very good money for discovery mission programs, for a Europa mission, for Mars. It was just a great budget all around. The Senate came out with a slightly lower number. They came out with a much lower number on planetary, mainly as a means to have a negotiating tactic with the House. But regardless, historically, in the patterns that we've seen, the House number for planetary science tends to be the number that gets through at the end. So we were looking at a possible budget for planetary science of $1.85 billion for 2017. That is a fantastic budget. That is well beyond our goals we had set for ourselves a few years ago.
What was our goal a few years ago?
1.5 billion. So we were looking at a $300 million increase over our goal, which we're totally supportive of. It was generally a very good bill, but right at the end of last year's legislative session, the Trump transition team asked the Republicans in Congress to not do anything until they come into power. Hence why we have a continuing resolution right now. So again, we're waiting for this to happen, but this is why our legislative priorities tend to be focused still on 2017 budget, even though we're in the midst of the 2017 fiscal year.
Casey, what about and I better remind folks once again, because we've still had a few more people come on the phone line. Welcome to you as well. Please do mute your phone if you are participating that way, and we will let you know when we're ready to take your live questions. And if you have both YouTube and the phone open, you can't do that, as you probably are discovering, because the YouTube signal is latency. It's much delayed, so you really need to do just one or the other, I'm afraid. Casey,
Matt is a gearhead, everybody. He loves
he says that all the time.
He loves his electronics. He's cooking for it.
Casey, what about the sort of our priorities, what we'd like to see happen for NASA's budget overall?
Well, overall, we'd like to see NASA's budget grow, obviously. And we've been working with a coalition of other industry, academic, and research groups asking for a 5-over-5 plan. 5-over-5, 5% increases per year for the next 5 years. It's modeled after what happened with the National Institutes of Health back in the 1990s. You saw a gradual doubling of the NIH budget through these annual small steps that just compound with each other and slowly increase the overall capability, funding, and focus of the agency. So we're pushing for that. We've actually seen it's not a bipartisan level of support for. Sorry, we're getting a lot of feedback from some people on the line.
Yeah, really, please do mute your phone if you have that capability. We're hearing someone cough there.
So we also have this opportunity here we think is supported by both Republicans and Democrats in Congress. And we have this, historically in the last few years, they have been coming naturally with increases over the president's request. The biggest one we saw was a 7% increase in NASA's budget in 1 year. That was a $1.3 billion increase over the request. That's a really good sign to me. I think we're seeing a lot of openness and understanding by folks in Congress who see that NASA is being asked to do a whole lot right now. And as we keep saying, and as it's not just us, it's the National Academy of Sciences and others around the country, that NASA is always asked to do too much and given too little. So there's an awareness of that, and we're trying to build on this opportunity. Now, that said, we can talk about how this is going to be, the math is going to be challenging here potentially in the future. We can get to that point. But fundamentally, we're asking to continue these series of increases, where our other legislative priorities are to pass this authorization bill because NASA could use that guidance from Congress. It's also a good use of Congress to bring people together to focus on NASA's mission. And also this authorization bill does embrace Mars as the goal for human spaceflight, which we really like to see. And then the other thing is we want to make sure that the House number for planetary science, $1.85 billion, is the actual number that comes through at the end of the appropriations process in April. And those are our immediate priorities. We have larger priorities in general, but these are the most immediate ones here in the next few months.
With that, Casey, you have gone a long ways toward answering the first of the questions that we're going to take today. This one comes from the gluten-free nerd. That's what it says here in the chat window. With plans for Orion moving forward, should we expect approval to increase the budget to NASA through adjustments in proportion of tax funds allocated to NASA? I'm not sure I understand that, but I think maybe talking about increasing the NASA budget at least as much as the inflation rate?
That would be a very important goal. And I think, so let's talk about where we are in terms of the big picture here. And this is where I think, if anything we've learned from 2016 is making political prognostications is a risky game. And this is where we're trying to be aware of what's happening, but not to make too many long-term predictions because we're in a lot of uncertainty here. So
long-term presumptions.
Presumptions. Thank you, Bill.
No, just we're not going to presume
that
NASA's budget will get increased, but we're hoping it will be based on the idea, if I understand this, Casey, that we have bipartisan support.
Yeah, and I should say we're not just hoping, we're working to make that happen. And yeah, and it's true. So here's where we are, though. Here's the math, and this is where I think we do honestly have some very strong supporters in Congress who are in power in Congress, Republicans, who do want to see this grow. However, here's the math. We have, from what we understand, the intention to have a very large tax cut coming through. We have the intention to have a large infrastructure spending bill. We have the intention to have increased spending on the military side of the US budget. And we've also had a stated intention to go after and to diminish and to decrease the part of the budget that's called non-defense discretionary. Basically, that's what funds what we think of as government. That's where NASA is funded out of. That's where the National Science Foundation is funded, National Endowment for the Arts, roads, veterans, healthcare, you name it, the FBI, Homeland Security, all of this is funded out of non-defense discretionary. They have stated that they want to diminish this over the years by about 20% over the next 4 years. And so if NASA's pot of money that it draws from shrinks, NASA itself is going to have a hard time maintaining its current budget. You know, basically it means it's growing in proportion to its shrinking pool that it can draw from, much less grow. Now, we don't know for sure if this will be the outcome. Parties in power tend to learn to love deficit spending, right? Because no one wants to, it tends to be very politically unpopular to cut popular programs, go figure. And the issues here is that, are we really going to see, and this is what no one really knows yet, there's a very strong contingent in the House of Representatives in particular, who are truly committed to cutting big portions of government in order to pay for these other items. We don't know if they're a big enough contingent yet to override a more moderate wing or more free spending wing of the Republican Party, or if they find some sort of coalition of Democrats and Republicans to come together and pass some bigger spending bills. So we're going to find out here relatively soon, basically, where people's true belief systems exist, and also how committed they are to them in the face of real political consequences.
Now, if I understand this, Casey, the idea, is it true that there's a belief that, a presumption, that if you cut NASA's budget, commercial space companies will step in to fill the void? Is that a myth, or is that believed, presumed by many staff members of congressmen and senators?
I think there's two questions there, I think. The first part is, yes, it is a myth. The private industry cannot just come in. NASA funds most of private industry, what we call private space right now. There was a good article in the Wall Street Journal about a month ago that someone leaked SpaceX's financials to the Wall Street Journal. SpaceX is a privately held company. They don't have to publish their financials, but someone found a way to do it. And half of their revenue comes from NASA contracts. Half of SpaceX's revenue. And SpaceX has been making a razor-thin profit for the last couple of years and lost about $20 million last year due to their explosion on the pad. So same goes for a lot of other commercial companies. They either depend directly on NASA contracts, or they depend indirectly on NASA missions, an industrial base, a supplier base to give them support. So
well,
without
the charming turn of phrase, was it Alan Shepard on the moon, who said, it's comforting to realize we got here on hardware built by the lowest bidder.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might think of NASA as a government program, but a government organization, but it hires businesses.
80% of its budget goes out to contractors around the country.
And civil servants to contractors.
Yeah. And so the only truly private space companies that are out there right now are Virgin Galactic is one. Blue Origin is another one. These are funded exclusively by investors. Blue Origin is probably the most capable one, but notably far less capable still than SpaceX, even though they have very big ambitions. You have a few other deep space industries, Planetary Resources, smaller companies that are looking to do sorts of mining and other economic expansion. But notably, they're working very hard to get NASA missions, to get NASA investment, to get a regulatory framework that supports them. And so should NASA's budget diminish, programs like Commercial Crew depend entirely on NASA, and NASA is the only customer who would ever use Commercial Crew at the moment. Now, the question is, will that be the case in the future? Well, we don't know, but this is why you have, this is why we have these public-private partnerships. And you're helping these companies get over this investment hump to ideally then create a new market. We don't know if that'll be successful, but if NASA's budget disappears and they don't support these things, there's no private, and don't forget science too. Private industry does not invest in basic research and development. That's literally why we have a public sector, to do this basic stuff that we don't know how it'll pay off, and then we turn that over to the public sector.
You can't land on Mars without a map.
Private sector.
You can't land on Mars without a map.
Exactly,
the map comes from,
right.
It's the same model. Lewis and Clark went across North America, and then the Continental Railroad was built.
Great analogy.
Yeah. So we have some more questions?
We do. Casey, I just want to throw in here, listening to you as I get to do.
It's complicated.
It is complicated, but he makes it understandable, and I'm so glad he's on our side.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so you don't want me as an enemy, Matt.
So for the members who support us, thank you. I'll say again, and hiring Casey as our policy analyst has been fantastic, because these issues are complicated. And the society used to handle it as a member, as a charter member, I would say the society handled it ad hoc. Just as things came up, people addressed it. But with Casey and Jason full time on this, we were able to understand what needs to be done and that for which we should advocate, if I can use Latin grammar in English.
Thanks largely to you folks who are watching this or listening to this program right now.
Here, hit us with a question, Matt.
Absolutely.
Here's one for you, Casey. It comes from Jim Thorne. Any idea who might be appointed to be director of OSTP, Office of Science and Technology Policy? First, you might want to remind us of why that's so important.
Well, classically, the director of the OSTP has been also the chief science advisor to the president. So John Holdren was in that position for the last 8 years, and it's a relatively small office. Its budget is probably on the order of $5 million a year, but it employs maybe 20 to 30 full-time science experts to advise the president and also to find ways to direct the federal government to make smart investments in important scientific ventures. So we don't know. A couple of names have been floated, and they're actually escaping me right now. Both of them that we've seen come out of academia, but they tend to come out of more of the fringe elements of academia. And the common theme that we've seen so far is a deep skepticism to climate change and the human role in climate change. That is fitting in with the political slant of this current administration. And the response so far that we have seen from the scientific community has been highly negative on both names that have been floated. Now, we have no idea, honestly. It strikes me as likely that this administration has not spent a ton of time yet on this level of decision-making process for appointment. And again, I bring this back to there are almost 700 positions that need to be approved by the Senate. And they've only nominated something on the order of 40 people.
I heard the other day, I think it's like 52 now.
We're up to 52. So a lot more work has to be done. So we have a couple of names that we've seen. And again, I think that one was a computer scientist from Yale, and the other one was a theoretical physicist from Princeton. So,
both of whom are skeptical of human-caused climate change.
Yes, that was the common thread between the two of them.
A related question. And this one comes to us from Lorelei Schreiber. Who's in the running for NASA administrator? And anybody want to express opinions as to whether they are good candidates for that job? So
just between us friends here, right? We have no. So there's a couple names being floated. This is one of their class. This is the every 4 to 8 year parlor game that we have of who's going to be the next NASA administrator. Honestly, again, we just don't know. I can tell you a few names that have been floated around, and that's take it with a big salt lick, because as our own advisor, Bill Adkins, used to say, those who know don't talk, and those who talk don't know. And that's generally a good rule of thumb for stuff in DC. But here's what we do know from what we've heard talking. Jim Bridenstine is widely believed to be the leading candidate. Jim Bridenstine is a congressman from Oklahoma's 1st District. He is very interested in space, actually, and has kind of made a name for himself. He put out a legislation either last year or the year before, the American Space Renaissance Act, which was this very large kind of holistic statement legislation. He didn't expect it to pass, but it involved military and civil space, deregulating frameworks to try to encourage a lot of commercial stuff, taking some approaches to gathering new weather data and commercial data to fill in missing gaps of capability for weather and climate monitoring. It's really not, I mean, he would be a perfectly fine candidate, I think. He would come in with a very strong commercial bent, also skeptic on climate change issues, so we don't know exactly how that would impact Earth science at NASA. He is also, he's actually also come out, you can tell he's in the running because he actually came out very recently, despite being a pro-commercial space advocate, he came out very strongly in support of the Space Launch System and Orion, which probably means that's one of your approval process steps to get approved by the Senate. So we've been
in other words, Casey, what you're saying is if there were someone who said he or she doesn't believe in supporting the Space Launch System, he or she would probably not get the job as
They would not get approved by the Senate. Yeah, that's true.
The nature of politics, just to be clear.
And
Yes.
such a clear sign of the amazing level of support for those programs, the
Yep.
XLS and Orion, in both the House and the Senate.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. So he's a leading candidate. We've heard names of Doug Cook, who used to work in the space shuttle program. He'd be kind of more in your classic vein of NASA administrator, maybe like I'm trying to think back to a good example, but he'd be more of your classic
Webb.
contractor. What's that, Bill?
James Webb.
Sure. Maybe too far back, but
what's a classic administrator? Man?
yeah, well, you're kind of
Sean O'Keefe.
yeah, maybe in that sense, you're more of like taking on existing contracting methods and doing your old school, which is not meant in any sort of diminutive way there.
Old school with putting people on the moon, mapping Mars, making spacecraft that are leaving the solar system that are still operating. That's sort of old school.
Yeah, old school. I think it's more of a contracting difference between your so-called new space and so-called old space approach to things. We've also heard Lamar Smith has put out Charles Alachi, the former director of JPL, as a name. There's Scott.
That to me is that's a fascinating choice, Casey.
It would be.
For those of you who are familiar with these two names, Lamar Smith from Texas, very conservative guy. Charles Alachi, immigrant to the U.S. from Lebanon, very, very popular director of Jet Propulsion Lab. Is that accurate? People loved him. He's the guy that said continually how much he admired Teddy Roosevelt and his phrase, "Dare mighty things."
And a great scientist in his own
And a
right.
fantastic scientist, and everybody loved him at JPL. So if you have a conservative like Lamar Smith supporting a progressive or a guy from California like Charles Alachi, that says a lot. That this is bringing people together. Space is bringing out the best in us. And so I interrupted you, Casey, because I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
Lead on with your next proposed candidate.
And we have many more questions.
Sure. So so we have we can kind of call it there. There's a bunch of names. Okay. I think it's widely common wisdom is Jim Bridenstine is the leading candidate. And so we'll be tracking this. We've heard rumors left and right that there'll be a nomination soon, but lots of stuff keeps happening in the White House that probably are taking up a lot more energy and attention than the NASA administrator nomination. So, but again, we should know hopefully soon.
Read on, Matt.
We are past the halfway point, I'll mention first, in this space policy update for this select group of viewers, people who have done so much to support our work here, the kind of work that you're hearing about, and that we're going to talk more about the real priorities, things that the Planetary Society will be up to in the very near future, including next week. We're going to get to that very soon, and we're going to get to those phone calls.
I want to get a question, Matt.
Here they come. I had one right here that looked like it was relevant. Some of these are very general questions, which I think we'll wait until right at the end, and we may go a little bit past 11:30 as well.
11:30 Pacific time.
Let's see. The gluten-free nerd. How do you expect Pruitt's appointment to impact the program based on your current view on the administration's take on human impact on the environment? And that is the new Secretary of the Interior.
Of the EPA.
I'm sorry, EPA Director. Sorry,
EPA,
my mistake.
No, the names were thrown around. Well, I think one of the things you talked about a few times, Casey, was regulation. And space launches have regulations just like airplane runways and airports. So I imagine there'll be a way to, I can imagine Mr. Pruitt wanting to enable more launches with less energy spent on environmental impact statements. I'm imagining that. And then people want to have spaceports in New Mexico and Texas. Spaceport is like an airport, but there's concerns downrange. I went by the pad where the big explosion was last September. Man, when a rocket blows up, it's serious business. So I imagine the Environmental Protection Agency will work less with the Federal Aviation Administration on rocket launches. Casey, do you have any opinion on that?
I don't have any much more to add than that.
Yeah.
Here's a question from Robert Berkowitz, which has largely already been addressed. Robert asks, what are the key immediate priorities of the Planetary Society in response to the current landscape that you have covered, Casey, regarding NASA and government funding? I think we've done a lot with that.
Well, we want bipartisan support for NASA and keep the NASA-funded, National Aeronautics and Space Administration funded. And we're very much hoping to increase the NASA budget 5% every year over the next 5 years, so that NASA can do all that it's already asked or legislatively obliged to do.
Yeah, and let me add one thing to that, which is in the context of this administration, I think it's not as big of a challenge as it may be for other agencies. And I believe that NASA does have an advantage here. What we've seen so far, at least hints in being leaked out of looking at what so we have a new director of the Office of Management and Budget. This is the person who ultimately approves and writes the president's budget request every year, which kicks off the annual budget cycle and also kind of sets the terms of the debate for that year on the budget. And
who is that, Casey?
Mick Mulvaney is the new director of OMB. He was just approved, I think, last week. He was a very a strong fiscal conservative. A Tea Party Republican, came in, has voted against most every single budget, voted against raising the debt limit. He has said he is ready to be the most hated man in Washington. So that's all gives you a sign of where he's going to go with this. However, at the same time, a lot of the influence that we've seen on the budget that has leaked out so far comes from the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank. And for the last few years, they've been putting out these budget blueprints of here's what we would do given a perfectly conservative ideal situation, which is effectively where they are right now. And the leaks that coming out of the Trump administration about their budget have matched very closely with this Heritage budget proposal. And you look at that, they go after energy funding in the Department of Energy, research funding in the Department of Energy. They cut EPA funding, National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, and so forth. But notably, in that budget, there's no mention made of NASA and no mention made of the National Science Foundation. So I think that gives you an insight into that NASA really is much more of a bipartisan agency, seen as that way, seen as worthwhile investment by fiscal conservatives. And also, I think there is a fondness for NASA at the top levels of this administration. Don't forget, in the inauguration address, of the few things that were mentioned about science, to unlock the mysteries of space was one of the phrases that President Trump used. That's a good sign. Jeff Sessions, his new attorney general, used to be the senator of Alabama, Marshall Space Flight Center, right? We've heard that there's support in the higher levels of his administration for NASA, that they love NASA and see it as a mark of American capability and technological pride. We're going to keep pushing that as an argument, and if they want to talk about jobs and good investment in high-paying jobs in this country, precision machining, engineering, science, all sorts of levels of jobs are enabled by investments in space. So I think there's a natural alignment here. At the same time, whether that fondness for space gets translated through the whole budget process into an investment in space is a different matter. And that's where things have broken down in the past for every president.
That's what we like to say, though. All the money that's spent in space is actually spent here on Earth.
Right. No one takes credit cards in space, right? there's no payment processing. So, yeah.
Is that okay, Casey? Can we move on?
I'd say that's fine.
Okay, I was going to say, I want to make good on this promise to open it up to the phones for people who have joined us by phone and see if you have any questions for Casey or Bill. So the first person to jump in here, if anybody would like to give it a shot, we'll see if we can make good on that. Anybody on the phone?
They have to unmute.
Yeah, you do have to remember to unmute your phone, of course. No, I guess everybody's happy. We know you're out there because we do hear some of this. We also were heard that from one person that there may be some dropouts from the phone. We apologize for that. It probably is our conference call service.
Let's take another question.
It's going to be okay. Has anybody now come up with a question? Have you unmuted? And we'll let you jump in here. Nope. Okay. I'm going to go back to the chat window that we have open in YouTube then, and we're going to go to some of the more general questions before we get on to what Casey is going to be up to next there in DC with his associate, Jason Callahan. Let's see. Here's one. This is from Arthur Crumry, by the way, or Crumray. Is there an agreement that governs the Russia-US cooperation with the ISS? Are there risks with the sanctions and alleged hacking? Well, there seems to be a risk to the entire relationship with Russia.
So keep in mind, we still buy, the Atlas V still runs on RD-180 engines.
Yep.
That are built in Russia, which are generally agreed. Apparently, the nozzle on those engines is fantastic. And this is where you have positive relationship, where it's an aerospace high-tech relationship between the United States and Russia. And the Atlas V is what Lightsail 1 flew on. It's a venerable rocket. And so we hope that that relationship keeps going. And if you want to go to the International Space Station right now, you go on a Russian rocket. So whether or not, please, Casey, chime in.
I just want to add to that. That's exactly right. And this is one of the areas in which the space program and the decisions made about engaging Russia in the post kind of Cold War era in the 90s have really paid off at a certain level, because we're forced to work together regardless of larger geopolitical tensions. Now, obviously, there's a lot going on with the Trump administration and Russia that is yet to be determined. And I'd say there's probably different factions of the Trump administration that are taking different approaches to Russia. But fundamentally, even looking at Obama, which had a higher tension with Russia, there was always an exemption in any legislation or sanctions. There's always an exemption that allowed NASA to continue to work with the Russian Space Agency to have access to the space station. And so in a sense, it's really working as designed. We're forced to work together, even if in increasing tensions, we depend on each other. Neither country would have a human spaceflight program without the other right now. And so that has been very good. And there has been an awareness and a open acceptance that they always have to carve out exceptions for the space station and that mutual cooperation there. And Charlie Bolden always would say, relations with the Russians on space have never degraded. They've always been very, very solid. So
and
that's a good
everybody, it's not just cosmonauts and astronauts. It's space flyers from around the world go to the International Space Station. And very strong arguments have been made that the best thing about the space station is statecraft, is relationships between countries. People from Australia, from Canada, Scandinavia, Japan, France have flown on the space station, and everybody shakes hands and has to get along. And we will see if the sanctions affect transactions with respect to rocket engines. But if I were a betting guy, I'd say they probably won't. Those exemptions will always be.
Yeah, they've lifted them. They've been lifting them for a few years. There's actually been kind of interesting committee battles between John McCain and Richard Shelby about releasing the flow of the RD-180 engines, because there is technically legislation that says the U.S. has to move away from those in the next 10 years, but they keep pushing it back.
Here's a question from Autumn Sky, which sounds a lot like October Sky, but it's, do you think the current administration would increase funding for finding near-Earth objects and perhaps in planetary defense efforts?
That's one of our core four over here at the Planetary Society, is human spaceflight, robotic exploration, search for life, and protection of the Earth. Defending the Earth from an asteroid. There is no evidence that the ancient dinosaurs had a space program. And so to Autumn Sky's question, we work very hard to encourage the search for near-Earth objects and in the background, prepare to do something about it. Studies have been funded about how you would deflect or redirect an asteroid. And so this is a great question. I'll just tell you, I will again thank you for your support, because we have been able to get spacecraft, NEOWISE spacecraft, redirected or directed to search for near-Earth objects in an effort to keep the Earth from getting hit with a big one that would be Control-Alt-Delete for human civilization. So stick with us. Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to add to that. This has been a really interesting example of how funding gets released ultimately sometimes in government. where we have seen in the last 6 years, we have seen an order of magnitude increase in near-Earth object detection funding at NASA. The project was at roughly $4 million a year when Obama first took office. But when he left office, it was over $50 million a year. And that's not enough to make a dedicated spacecraft, but they have enormously enhanced the number of ground-based telescopes and research time and other efforts to detect near-Earth objects.
Analysis, yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why that happened wasn't that the arguments for planetary defense changed. It was because national space policy under Obama was to have humans visit an asteroid, and then it became the asteroid redirect mission, grab an asteroid and bring it back to the moon. Well, how do you get an asteroid to grab? We have to find it. So suddenly near-Earth objects became very much more practical to the human spaceflight side of NASA. And the money increased significantly to enable that program, not necessarily for planetary defense. So it's one of the interesting things. You can tie it to, whenever you can tie a program to national priorities that are very immediately pragmatic and practical, you can really get a boost. Even if you don't, the arguments are slightly different, the consequences are still the same. We've invested a lot more in planetary threatening defense object detection because of ARM.
That's the hard part, everybody, is finding. Yeah. As the old saying goes, it's like looking for a charcoal briquette in the dark.
Right.
They're hard to find. They can be found, but it's difficult.
Yeah. So the implication there, if ARM goes away, you might see a decrease in funding for planetary defense because it's no longer practical immediately.
Asteroid redirect, and sometimes asteroid redirect.
Robotic redirect.
Mission.
ARM, the pirate version of that.
And here is a selfish plug. If you really want to hear more about what's happening with NEOs, at least on the science side and the policy side, this week's edition of Planetary Radio, the podcast version, has this live show that we did just last week from here in Pasadena, and it goes into great detail with some really outstanding experts in this field. One more question before I want to get us on to talking about what you're going to be up to in the near future, Casey. And this one comes from Mike Broom. How do you think the new authorization act or new administration will help advance incorporating the moon into the economy? Aside from Lunar X Prize, what moonshot companies are shooting for the moon? And I would maybe expand this to talk about not just the moon, but those companies like Planetary Resources that are looking to make a profit off of what we can find in space.
The authorization bill doesn't do much explicitly. It does call for national space policy to include space development. So in addition to exploration, to creating new markets, the big question here is, will the Trump administration really embrace a kind of market-driven or focus to basically take as a given of NASA that it's one of its jobs is to create a space market, particularly on the moon?
So, and along this line, we at the planetary side have worked hard to promote the idea that we can put humans in orbit around Mars in 2033 without substantially increasing the NASA budget, just keep it, adjusting it for inflation.
Right.
And in that architecture, as it's called, a scheme, a system, or a sequence of missions of space flights, one of the schemes that's very reasonable includes going back to the moon. Now, making money at the moon, that's a difficult thing. And
that's a big question.
As a mechanical engineer who took a lot of physics, this idea that you'd go to the moon and harvest helium-3 to make a fusion reactor is really an extraordinary idea. That's not something you're going to do in the next 2 weeks.
Well, step one is to create fusion reactors.
Oh, that's a really hard thing.
It's around the corner. It always has been.
It's always 40 years away, but maybe it'll be 10 years away. But it's a really hard thing. So making money at the moon is different from using the moon as a training base or a depot for going beyond the moon, and especially sending humans to Mars. And just say again, thank you for your support. We convened a meeting of 70 of the world's foremost authorities on human spaceflight. And we presented, or an architecture was presented that we believe is executable and affordable. And we really encourage the new administration to embrace, to at least look at this plan. And if you come up with a plan that I bet it'll be similar. And the idea is that we really could do it in our lifetime if we just focused on getting humans to Mars and using the same model that was used in the Apollo era, where Apollo 8 orbited the moon first before people went there and landed a year and a half later. So we strongly believe the same idea can happen at Mars. And this business of teleoperating spacecraft on the surface of Mars, when you're close enough to have radio signals that are much faster than 7, 11, or 20 minutes, which they are now when Mars is on the other side of the sun. So if you're listening out there, take a look at our plan to get to Mars, which includes some trips to the moon as part of the overall architecture.
We are rapidly approaching what is at least the nominal expected close of this space advocacy update. And Casey, I wanted to make sure that we get a chance to hear from you about what's coming up. You got a busy week next week.
Yes, Bill and I both, actually. Bill's going to be meeting me in D.C. We're going to be actually meeting with Mr. Bridenstine, or Congressman Bridenstine, to meet with him and discuss our space policy, your space policy priorities as members of the Planetary Society. We are going to be participating once again in the Space Exploration Alliance's Legislative Blitz. We have a record number of people, around 100 people this year, coming to D.C. on their own dime, which is just amazing, and it's always a delight to see that level of commitment. And we have almost 200 meetings set up around Congress to promote space science and exploration. I will also be meeting with a bunch of other congressional offices, and we're going to really be getting our message out in our big push this year. And that'll be, that's next week. And we also have, we'll be delivering our recommendations on the transition that we've had already delivered to the transition team a few months ago. We will be releasing these publicly here soon. Bill and I are working on just getting the finalization of that publication out. And we're really set up quite nicely, I would say. We also have our colleague, Jason Callahan, who lives in DC area and has been continuously in touch with members of the civil service workforce at NASA and the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So
as we like to say, just this thing, everybody, Washington, D.C. is a small town based on trust and relationships. So having Casey and Jason there is how I believe, are being more effective than ever in getting this idea that we can afford to put humans on Mars. We can search for life on other worlds. This extraordinary announcement yesterday from TRAPPIST-1 star with 7 planets closer to the star than Mercury is, yet 3 of them are in the habitable zone because it's an ultra cool dwarf star. These things are all part of the best use of our intellect and treasure. Space exploration brings out the best in all of us. And by having this close relationships, which we continue to develop in congressional offices in Washington, we strongly believe we can advance space science and exploration, which is our mission. So thank you all again for your support. Lead on, Matt.
I'm glad you brought up, I think you lost your mic there.
Is the world still spinning?
Oh my goodness, where'd it go? It fall in your lap, maybe? Here it is. We'll get Bill hooked up again. I'm glad he mentioned TRAPPIST-1 because we did get a question about that from Mary Powell or Cole. And if you haven't looked at it already, check the Google homepage today because Google was right on top of it.
Oh, good. Yeah. I was on CNN this morning with Nick Siegler from Jet Propulsion Lab, and I was on CNN last night talking about TRAPPIST-1. It's really an extraordinary thing. So use the Spitzer Space Telescope, trailing the Earth at a gravitationally orbitally balanced place, and the European Southern Observatory in Chile, and a couple other telescopes around the world to realize that there is no gas giant orbiting the star, yet there are 7 much smaller planets. It's a classic international cooperation with NASA in the lead, the world's largest space agency in the lead. And you all supported this effort because it is how we address this deep question. Are we alone in the universe? If we find a water-bearing planet where we can observe the atmosphere with these extraordinary instruments, maybe we will find signs of life, Matt. It's very exciting, and it brings people together.
Well, and from a policy perspective, don't forget the Spitzer Space Telescope is over a decade old, right? It's been extended by NASA over the years. It's a conscious decision, and Congress decides to continue to pay for it, right? And they went to Spitzer because you needed a 24-hour opportunity to observe this system. And they got a ton of time. They got like 20 observing days in a row on Spitzer, which shows you how important this observation was. So space telescopes enable this kind of discovery. And this is one of the things we talk about. And one of the things Heidi Hamill on our board works at is at the Space Telescope Science Institute in Aura for research universities, part of these space telescopes programs. And so James Webb, when it launches in the next 2 years here, just a tad over a year and a half from now, actually, we'll be able to attempt to look at the atmospheres of these planets. WFIRST, which we're trying to get spun up to be the next big observatory in space, will have an exoplanet detection capability. TESS, which is the Transiting Exoplanet Survey.
That's next year.
That's
telescope.
This year, I think.
This year, yeah.
Next year.
2017, Bill.
No, they pushed it to 2018.
Oh, it has slipped.
But all that
that's
aside,
like super.
And you guys, everybody out there, the amount of money spent on these missions over the course of decades that it takes to design and build them is just so small compared to the money we spend on all sorts of other things. So thank you again for your support. It is through your support that we're able to advocate for these missions, which I strongly believe affect human history, that are historic.
Casey, anything else that you have coming up, you and Jason Callahan, that we should hear about?
Well, we're going to be participating in the Planetary Science Visions at 2050 workshop here that NASA's convening next week. And that's going to be helping to set this long-term vision for space exploration at NASA with robotic space flight. We are promoting the Europa mission, just entered phase B. We're actually doing a big study on the current status of the Mars exploration program, which, despite having a big new flagship class rover coming down the pipeline, has nothing else in the pipeline, which is a bad place to be for a program, and a program that is going to be collecting samples that have currently nothing to retrieve them off the surface of Mars.
So everybody out there, I'm sure a few of you are geologists. The geologists believe, this is my impression, Matt, that if they had the right rock from Mars, if they have the right rock from Earth, they can tell who the president is. They can tell who the president's going to be looking at rocks. The geologists are so into it. And so they want to bring back samples from Mars because they believe they'll be able to tell who is president of Mars. That's a joke. They'll learn a lot about Mars's past, which informs us about our place in the solar system. So right now, the Mars 2020 rover is going to drill and collect samples, but there is no formal follow-on mission or mission after that to bring samples back to the Earth. But we're working on it. We're here for you.
We are working on it. And I like to point out that no other organization focuses on this. And just going back to, Bill, what you've been saying, thanking people, and Matt, what you brought up, when I came to the society, this year is my 5th year at the Planetary Society. Thank you, Bill.
No, it's great, man.
And no, I literally, Bill hired me almost 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, we had no follow-on mission to Curiosity rover. We had no mission to Europa. Planetary science was in a budget free fall. And in the last 5 years, with the just incredible response that we've had from our members, we've sent over 400,000 letters to Congress in this time. We've raised a really just solid amount of money to support this program. We have grown from, as Bill said, no permanent position to 2 permanent positions focusing on space policy and advocacy for the society.
Developing these relationships in Washington where Casey and Jason are able to, and once in a while I go into an office and make the case. This is, everybody, this is what the public wants. Here are 54,000 members and several 100,000 people in our extended community that support this. This is what people want. This is what you could do with our tax dollars that advance space science and exploration, spending money on Earth, which enriches our economy. We would not have this technology that we're using right now without the space program over the last 40 years. So and you've heard Casey talk about it. It's a complicated business with a lot of moving parts to influence policy. There's many, 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 many line items in the federal budget, and we're here to get congressmen and senators and the staffers to adjust the budget so that we advance space science and exploration. So thank you very much for your support.
And I want to say it worked. And that's what I'm saying. In 5 years, now we have a mission to Europa. We have the Mars 2020 rover. We have a budget for planetary science that is growing beyond anyone's expectations just a few years ago. And that has been because of the incredible output of you, our members, and enabling us to be able to work year round for this program. So it's been a spectacular success. There's lots more work to do. But this has been really amazing to see.
Just one more thing. I was with Nick Siegler, Dr. Siegler, this morning on CNN, and he's going to meet with John Culberson this afternoon. And John Culberson's a congressman from Texas who loves Europa, the moon of Jupiter with twice as much seawater as the Earth, which is a reasonable place to find living things. And John Culberson loves this. So I gave Nick a note to give to Congressman Culberson to come visit us today.
Oh,
if you're out there listening, Congressman, come on by for a few minutes. We'll give you a cup of coffee. We have some coffee cake. It'll be great.
We may actually see him next week, Bill.
Yeah, I hope so. He's a character. I love that guy.
He's been
fun.
on Planetary Radio, and we had a good time.
Yeah.
He is sure enthusiastic. Yeah. Casey, someday we've got to tell people why you had to climb a tree on your first day with the Planetary Society, but we'll save that for another day since we are
people something to tune in for in the future.
We're in overtime. I don't think this is the last one of these live updates that we'll be providing, but it may be a little while before we do this again. How are we working in other ways to keep our members and donors informed of what we're up to, the kind of stuff we've been talking about?
Well, of course, there's the Planetary Report. I have a article in there every single month, and this every single issue. And this next one will be I have a feature article about the Mars exploration program, in addition to my normal advocacy column. And Matt, you and I have started this really lovely podcast every month called the Space Policy Edition. It is currently the most popular space policy podcast in the world.
It is.
It actually.
No, we are unique, everybody. Thank you for your support.
Yeah.
The Planetary
This is the kind of
Society
stuff we
is
can
the
do.
largest non-governmental space organization in the world.
Yeah. And it's in the top 10% of all podcasts in the world. It is the only one to really focus on space policy.
Planetary Radio is the #1 independent podcast about space exploration, period.
Yep. So it's been, no ads. So it's great. Follow us on that if you haven't subscribed to it yet. It's on our planetary.org/radio. You can follow it there. And we will be coming out with more reports and videos and pieces in the future to help keep you posted. We have our new newsletter that we're putting out every month on space policy highlights. So there's lots of ways to stay engaged, because again, one of my most important jobs, I feel, is to help demystify this whole process of space policy at government, to really empower you to be able to make these decisions more effectively, to be a better advocate, and to just understand the process of how we as a nation, and even for our international members, how the US makes these decisions and add that pressure to make them make better decisions. So it's one of the great joys at which we do that we get to talk about this. And as Bill has said, we could not do this without you. And I just want to thank you all for that support you've given us and for the great questions, engagement. It's one of the great pleasures of my job.
Thank you, Casey. And we are so glad that you are there doing it for us, as I said. The next of those Space Policy Edition podcasts will be released on Friday of next week. It's the first Friday of the month each week. If you are enough of a policy wonk to have made it through this entire hour, now slightly more than an hour, then you might enjoy that program as well. We have a great time doing that with Jason Callahan. Bill, any last comments?
Thank you. And I'm looking forward to representing you next week in the U.S. Congress to advance space science and exploration, make sure we get a follow-on mission to Mars, and for the Mars rovers, and get human space flight to Mars as the focus. With let's pick a day, as the song goes. Set a day, and we'll get out there with people. We'll continue to defend the planet. We'll advance robotic and human exploration, and that search for life, which has driven me since I was a little kid. Are we alone in the universe? It's a fundamental question. Everybody wants to know, and for that, you have to explore space. And the big message that Casey and I are going to deliver to U.S. Congress, no matter where you're watching in the world, is no big reset. Let's stay the course. We've got all these programs being funded. Let's keep them going. They're part of a larger whole. Let's not have a catastrophic cancellation of one of them. We can do this if we work together and keep our eye on the prize of going to Mars. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. Let's change the worlds.
Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Casey. And thank you to those of you who have tuned in today. Do keep track of what we're up to at planetary.org and through the other channels that Casey was just talking about. One more thank you, because we suspect that some of you out there probably help these so-called amateur, really semi-pro astronomers who are, who knows?
So an amateur astronomer is not like an amateur tennis player.
Yeah.
An amateur astronomer does productive, real astronomy.
As I said last week, they're amateurs in the way the college football players are amateurs. They're actually pretty good at this. They just don't get paid. And who knows? Maybe they'll help us save the world.
Save the world. Is that a big deal? Carry on, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll talk to you again sometime soon, and we sure appreciate your support. Take care.